Yes, thanks, Melissa. So I'm Patty Lutsky. I'm the Product Management Director for Arbortext Products. And we're excited that we just had some releases at the end of November, and we want to go over those with you. This is the high-level calendar for what we've had in the past few months, and then a little bit of looking forward into next year. In April, we had our bug fix release, the 8110. In July was our 8020. And by the way, where I have 81 for the Arbortext, it would be 121 for the Arbortext layout developer and layout editor products. Anyway, in July was the 8020, 12020 release, and we expect that that will be the last maintenance release on the 80 stream. Just this past November, we released our 8120, 12120, and that's what we'll be going over for this webinar. I won't go over this list here because I do have slides related to this going forward. And then looking forward into next year, of course, anything that's in the future is subject to change. And, this just to give you a rough idea of what we're thinking. But we are expecting another maintenance release, 8130, in roughly the April timeframe. And then our next feature release, the 8.2 and 12.2, for, again, roughly about a year from now, October, November 2022. This is, of course, a preliminary list, but some of the ideas would be continuing with our publishing engine improvements, providing the initial support for DITA 2.0, improving the web output in Styler, and of course, bug fixes. And hopefully maybe, some more in addition to this, but we just wanted to give you a rough idea of what we're thinking, all, of course, subject to change. Okay, let's get into the 8120 release. This is for Arbortext Editor, Arbortext Publishing Engine, and Arbortext Styler. The first new feature to talk about in Editor is that Editor will have increased knowledge of the status of objects that are in WINDCHILL. This is something that has been requested for quite some time, so I'm excited to be able to announce it. The general ideas in the past, for instance, if an object was in the release state, you would still have the checkout button be enabled, but then you would click checkout and then get an error that would say, no, you can't check this out. So now we do have the CMS browser aware of whether or not a given document can be checked out or not. And on the left, you could see the properties would explain, in this case, that it's in the release state, and lock status shows cannot be checked out. And more importantly, in the CMS browser for those objects, you would get the grayed out icon. So in the first green arrow is showing a grayed out icon for a individual document. And the second arrow is pointing to one for a compound document. And you can see where one of those is selected, that the edit button, checkout button, they're disabled, since you would not be able to check that out. You could still, of course, view the content. And lifecycle state is really the most common reason why perhaps it couldn't be checked out. But in general, the browser is just more aware of whether or not an object is eligible for checkout. The next major feature to announce is related to both editor and publishing engine, where now we do support requiring authentication when you submit published jobs from editor. So if you've got your security framework turned on and you configure it so that it requires authentication for publish requests, then when editor sends a published job, it can require the authentication. And this way you can limit published jobs to certain users or to users with a certain role. And in general, it's just moving in the direction that many of you know we've been doing for the past few years of increasing the ability to secure Arbortext publishing engine. So the general idea is when you're in the editor, either when you're configuring your server initially or when you do your first publish request, you'll get a dialog box up where you would enter your Tomcat credentials, and then those credentials would remain for the duration of that editor session. And the authentication itself is configured in Tomcat. We provide an example login screen that you could see is fairly simple, but of course you can replace that with the authentication that's appropriate for your company's environment. This next screenshot is showing that we have made a change to the test PTC Arbortext publishing engine section at the bottom of the screen here. This is related to the change we've made earlier this year, where we deprecated the file parameter for the publishing engine f equals convert feature. And I believe it was in 8020 that left our test section not operating properly because we had deprecated that file parameter. So now at this point, we've simplified that. It used to have a number of options, but really what people use that for is tell me PE is working right. So we basically have this one button that says test publishing, and it will send a publish request to PE, and then just as it has in the past, it'll display the PDF output as a result of sending that publishing request. The other thing to mention on this screen is that a number of the items on this screen are now requiring authentication. So, out of the box, you might need to be a PE admin user to, for instance, see the transaction archive or the entire queue list. And actually, I believe that was configured in the previous release as well. A few other changes to Arbortext publishing engine. For PE 8120, we now support editor versions 8.0 or higher. So if you have an earlier version of editor, it will not be able to send the request to PE 8120. And excuse me. Of course, if you do have your security framework set up so that it requires the authentication in order to send publishing requests, then you need to have editor 8120, since that's the first editor version that supports the authentication. And as I mentioned, by default, when you turn the security framework on, there will be some functions that require that the user be PE admin, as we saw before. There will also be some requiring PE user, things like publishing or viewing the queue status from within editor. One other change that we've made with regards to setup is that in your configuration file, your e3 config.xml file, and of course, that's also the file where you set up and configure your security framework. By default, we have set the WINDCHILL requests as disabled. We're really just doing this to call attention to the fact that in general, given the communication that PE does with WINDCHILL and PE's ability to reach back into WINDCHILL to pull content, it is important to make sure that your publishing engine is deployed either on an intranet or that it's deployed in such a way that the server.xml will limit which clients have the permission to send publish requests to PE. So, you know, in your e3config.xml, we have the comment that you see here, and then the security constraint related specifically for WINDCHILL requests. So if you are deployed on an intranet and, you know, you would be able to just change that value from disabled to unrestricted to get the normal publishing from WINDCHILL that you've had in the past. One other change that we've made, this relates to the editor and the WINDCHILL integration. And this is as a result of a change that has happened on the WINDCHILL side for the WINDCHILL release that is due out later this month. In general, in the past, the editor was able to send a query to WINDCHILL to find out what type of authentication that WINDCHILL server required. So based on what it could determine, it would either put up the basic dialog box as part of our WINDCHILL integration to just get username, password, or it would get the form-based authentication and display that in its embedded browser in the connection dialog box. So again, beginning with the current the release that's due out very shortly, editor won't be able to determine upfront which type of authentication to use. So if you are using forms-based authentication, and that also covers some customers that, for instance, use multi-factor authentication or other things that require more than just basic, you need to add an additional setting in your adapter's siteprefs.xml. And you can see basically you just put the server name with a divisor and then the letters FBA to indicate that this server is a forms-based authentication. And then everything will continue as it has in the past. Another change for this release is that the WINDCHILL adapter will now be using the log4j2, similar to what we have already been doing with the rest of editor in 8.1.1.0. But what this means is that if you need to troubleshoot something with the WINDCHILL adapter and you need to turn on your logging for it, the mechanism for turning on the logging has changed. So in the past, there was a user prefs setting, or you could use an environment variable, the apt-wc log file environment variable, but those are no longer used. Instead, the logging specification will be in the same location as it is for the rest of editor. It'll be in your lib resources log4j2.xml file. And you can see by default, the adapter logger is off, but you can, of course, turn it on. And then also you can set it so that it'll have the append equals true if you want to be able to have a rolling log rather than individual log. Now, as always, we have a few deprecations. And so in 8.1.2.0, we have removed support for the compact installer. This was also referred to as the deploy kit. It doesn't remove the ability to have customizations that are deployed via what we refer to as zipped customizations, where you put your customizations into a zip file and make that available on a shared location. This is just related specifically to the deploy kit mechanism. We've also removed the PE SOAP support. Now, this was deprecated a while back in 8100. And now we have removed that SOAP support from Publishing Engine. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have deprecated the file parameter for the PE F equals convert request. This was actually done back in 8020 as well. So if you're publishing, really the document to publish should be in a post request, or else it should be using one of the other mechanisms, like the mechanism WINDCHILL uses when it does a publish. Okay, so that's the end of my section. Were there any questions?
Yeah, there was one question. Why is PostScript removed from the test?
We really just simplified it. The idea being to allow you to test whether the publishing is working or not. If you need to have a test like that, you would still be able to create a custom request to Publishing Engine to test that PostScript publishing is still working.
Okay, that was it for questions. Oh, there was one more question. Which web output improvements are expected on 2022?
That's actually a question for Simon. So I'll let Simon either answer it or not in his next section.
Might as well answer it now.
Okay.
We are looking at providing an up-to-date framework for delivering web output from style-sheet driven output. So you know how you can publish to web or publish to files. The framework that you publish into for web output is pretty out of date. So the idea that we're hoping for in 2022 is a new and up-to-date framework that uses sort of modern methods for including content.
Okay, thanks. That was it for questions for now.
Okay. Simon, do you want to go ahead and share then?
Yeah, let's give that a go. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm Simon Taylor. I'm your product manager for Arbortext Styler and for Layout Developer and Layout Editor. We're going to start with Arbortext Styler update first. You've already seen for Patty when that was released. So am I showing the wrong screen? What screen can you see?
The Arbortext Styler product update?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the funny banner thingy is on the wrong screen. Okay, that's good. So in this release, we've done some work on how Styler supports CSS. So let's get into that. The first thing that we did was allow you to associate external CSS files with your HTML file and HTML chunked output. So in the style sheet properties dialog box now, there is a field towards the bottom here, which allows you to associate one or more external CSS files. So you would hit add to associate a new one, and you would point to the CSS file or write the path for the new CSS file and include it in there. So when you go to publish your HTML output, you will have a link at the top in the head, as you can see down here, that points to your external CSS file. If you're going to use relative paths, make sure that the paths are relative to where the HTML is going to be deployed. Otherwise, the browser won't be able to pick it up. And if you're using absolute paths, make sure that the browser has access to those paths. Otherwise, you won't be able to use those CSS. But the idea of this feature is that you can use customized bits of CSS to enhance the CSS that gets generated by Arbortext Styler based on your style sheet. So as you know, Styler can generate CSS based on context and conditions or from property sets, and this allows you to add an extra layer onto that. So one of the things that was in our mind when we created this feature was you might have some media tests in there, for example, and a different set of styling that you would apply for some responsive HTML, if that's what you wanted to do. We've also added this idea of CSS definitions in this release of Styler. So there's a new tab in the Styler interface over here on the right. This tab allows you to create small chunks of CSS. So it's like the equivalent of a single style definition in your CSS. You can create that as an object in your style sheet. You have the opportunity to edit it. So if you create a new one, give it a name, hit edit, then you will get this dialog box and you can edit the CSS that you want. Okay, these are style sheet objects, so they can be managed like any other style sheet object. You can put them into modules and that kind of thing. So it's up to you to know the CSS that you want to write. We don't provide any helpers for that, but it lets you customize the CSS that you want to put in there. You can write anything you like in there. Together with that, we let you use those CSS definitions. So if you're familiar with Styler, you'll know there's the HTML tag category when you're applying style to context or a condition. If you open that up, you can add a new HTML attribute. And if you do the add HTML attribute, you can specify that you want to add a class attribute. If you're adding class, this CSS style option down here, which is new, will be enabled, and you can select one of the CSS styles that you've defined in your style sheet from a drop-down list. Okay, so you can say for this element, context or condition, I want to override whatever style will create to use my own custom CSS that I've defined within my style sheet. And I'm going to call it using the CSS style method based around the class attribute. And when you go to publish your HTML output, the style will be defined in the header of your HTML. And the class attribute that's assigned to the element that the transformation will make in your HTML output will point to that CSS style. Hopefully that's clear. Do we have any questions about that before I move on to the ALD stuff?
Nope, no questions at this time.
Cool. So the other product that we released last month was ALD release 12.120, and this is the update for that. So funnily enough, we've added some more support in ALD for CSS, so a bit of a theme between the two of my products. We've got some debugger improvements, and there's some minor enhancements, which I'll talk about towards the end. So the big deal in this release is that in Layout Developer now, you can use CSS as a style sheet language. Years and years and years ago, we had a very, very basic version of it, but in this release, we've got a much more complete version of CSS. We've tried to use as much CSS3 as we possibly can. The idea behind that is that we wanted to make Layout Developer more accessible to a lot more users. So it kind of lowers the barrier to entry, so you can get started using Layout Developer. If you have CSS, maybe from your web output, or you know CSS because you're a web developer or that kind of thing, you can now get started a lot more quickly and easily using Layout Developer. But this language works alongside the other styling methods that we have in Layout Developer. So you can get started using some basic CSS, and then you can override it if you want to by using some of the more complex methods that we have in Layout Developer. The CSS is applied before those other methods, so you can get the basic styling done and then add some more complex stuff if you want to later on. You can use all three methods CSS, context matching, and tag name matching, or you can disable one or more of those if you just want to use one or more of those. It comes with some simple tools to help you get started. There's some demos, and there are ways to configure your CSS handling within Layout Developer. So there's 3 ways of associating a style sheet with your XML content. The first way is to simply make an association using this macro tcss3 or this stream property. So you can say, here's my XML, here's my CSS, mix the two together and see what we get. We also support the XML style sheet processing instruction in your XML. That's an option that you need to turn on in the document preferences, but you can just let ALD pick up the CSS from wherever it is using XML style sheet. That CSS file can be either an internal tag or it can be an external file if you want to. And then the third way is a stream function which can be used to pick up a load of CSS definitions in a number of different places, collect them all together into one big place, and then let ALD apply it. We provide a sample function for doing this with HTML, and we provide some examples of how you would use that to associate CSS with HTML if you want to format HTML in Layout Developer. There's some system files that go with it. This one, scss.js, contains all the functions which have been written. This file here, the config, lets you set up some configuration options so you can turn on and off page processing. So this version of ALD CSS supports the @page functions to create and set up pages using CSS. So if you're familiar with the new CSS3 spec, then you can use that to define your page layouts in Layout Developer. There's some logging included in the scripting, so you can turn that on and off. So if you want to find out whether you're using allowed constructs within your CSS, you can turn that on. We've also provided a way of configuring defaults and initial values of some properties if you want to tweak those to more suit your needs. There's also this base HTML-based CSS, which we provide, and that's basically a set of default CSS styles for HTML. So it defines what type of display objects HTML elements should be, whether they're blocks or inline or list items, that kind of thing. And it provides a foundation for styling HTML in Layout Developer. And as I said, but there's also a bunch of sample files. We have a demo file, and we have an example which shows the @page processing, so you can get to grips with how Layout Developer is working with that. We've done some updates to the debugger in this version of Layout Developer. The first one is that we now have an interface in the debugger for viewing pages. So over in the resources panel, there's now a list of the pages. You can navigate to those pages inside your document using that interface, and you can find out information about that page or the current page by opening it in a tab, and you can see all this object structure that lets you sort of drill in to find out exactly where everything is and what content is being displayed on the current page. It also just shows you dimensions, it gives you links to tags if they're there, and it also lets you just view in a sort of read-only kind of way a lot of the information that you would see on a page. So it's kind of similar to the display objects, but it's more simplified, and it's a lot more readable than the display objects of the current page. You can also get access to other information about the page if you want to, using a context menu that's available on these icons here in the resource tree. We're going to be building on that in the next release as well to make it a lot more useful. We also now in the debugger allow previews of raster graphics. So in the resources tree, you never used to be able to see raster graphics. Now you can see the tags, you can get information about the tags, and you can also preview them. So this is a graphic shown in the edit window in the debugger. So you can sort of preview the graphics, make sure that they look like what you think they look like. So that's kind of useful. And we'll be, again, expanding on that in the future releases. Now onto the minor enhancements that we made in this release. So in the last release, we introduced this idea of being able to, not last release, a few releases ago, to be able to retry a page from a page end event. So in Layout Developer, as you're formatting through, you can assign a page end event to a particular page and then get it to retry the page a number of times. We limited that originally to 10, just because we didn't want people to have thousands of retries on a page and for the document to take forever to format. But one of our customers made us realize that 10's an okay number, but he might want to do it 20, 30, 40 times to make sure he gets the right output. So we've made it a configurable option, and it's up to the user to decide whether they're willing to sacrifice performance in favor of the multiple page retries. We've added an F toolbar group object. So when we released the Layout Editor tool, we allowed users to configure their toolbars using JavaScript. What we missed in that is the toolbar group. Toolbar groups allow you to group icons together in a particular way, but you can also call another toolbar from the toolbar group. So we added that to the object model to make it easier for people to create their toolbars that they want. We've added a new icon checkbox rather than the old tick boxes. The old tick boxes were a little bit ugly, so we've updated that. What I would say though is some people have used a slight flaw in our dialog box syntax, which allows them to create tick boxes without buttons. And if you do that, if you don't have the yes, no buttons, then these new icons won't work. We're going to fix that in the next maintenance release, but for now, you can keep to the old tick boxes. We haven't replaced the tick boxes. It's still an application preference that you can select which one you want. We've added another dialog box field mode, so you can click through some buttons. So if you want to assign a variable based on some icons or some buttons which you want to sort of allow the user to click through, so in this case, yes, no, or maybe, then you can do that now in dialog boxes. Quite a simple option. This idea of frame nudge allows you to use these properties, these macros, and add a value to each of the frame size, frame position, and frame rotation, such that you can just increase it by 1 millimeter or 1 point or whatever the current unit is. We've also allowed provided some keyboard shortcuts for that, so you can now use Alt and the left, right, up, and down buttons to move the frame across. You can use Shift, Alt, left, right, up, and down to increase the size and decrease the size. And if you use, I think it's Control, Alt, and left and right, you can rotate the frame clockwise and anti-clockwise. So that's really just like a simple usability. It wasn't very difficult to do, but if you're using something like Layout Editor, it makes your life a whole lot easier because you can do stuff quickly off the keyboard. We've also added the ability to add rules in line for your style. So if you've got some text that you want to put a box around in line rather than around the block or the paragraph, then you can apply that now using the fstyle.rules array. You can have up to 8 individual rules applied if you want to doing that. So it's kind of similar to the frules arrays that we have on paragraphs, blocks, frames, and tables and other objects. Inline rules, you can have 8 of them. 8 should be plenty. So you can have like nice little rounded corner boxes with dotted lines or background colors and that kind of thing around your text if you want to do that kind of thing. So that's everything for Layout Developer for this release. Hopefully everybody's excited about that.
And I'll mention for Simon that there will be a webinar coming up with more on CSS. So look for that. So I want to now talk about WINDCHILL service parts, information, and instructions. This is the new name for what was called WINDCHILL Service Information Manager and Service Parts. I think it's been a little while since I've presented, so I will start with with a couple features that came out in the 12.0.20 release for WINDCHILL. That was the one this past summer. One new feature in that release is the ability to manage translation packages in WINDCHILL. So in the past, when you would create a translation package, it would be created on a shared folder on the server. But now, if you prefer, you can create your translation package inside WINDCHILL as a document. And this way, the history is preserved inside WINDCHILL. And the general idea is that when you have updated content from your translation vendor, you would iterate this document and then set it to the translated state. And that would be the indication for the import process to kick off and run. So very similar to in the past, you would drop the zip file in a import folder. Now, instead, you would be updating the document and setting it to the appropriate state. And of course, the previous method is still available for those that want to continue to use a shared folder. Another enhancement in WINDCHILL 12.0.20 is the support for structure comparison of service structures. Now, the structure comparison is something that's been available for engineering structures for a long time. And now we're supporting it with your information structure or your publication structure. So the idea is if you want to compare, say, a previous version, that's what this screenshot shows, kind of comparing the A.2 to the A.1 version. Or if you have two structures that are very similar and you want to see the comparison of them, you can use the compare service structure action to get, or the compare to part structure action to see your comparison. Now, this is a new feature that's coming out in WINDCHILL 12.1. WINDCHILL 12.1 is due out soon, in December yet. So while it is forward-looking information, it should, hopefully it's pretty definite that this will be available shortly. We are offering a new post-publish delegate for Creo Illustrate published content. Now in Creo Illustrate, you have the ability to request additional formats. So in addition to the PVZ format that is essentially a zip file that contains multiple outputs, you can also request that your Creo Illustrate illustration be published, for instance, to a PNG or a JPEG or other formats. And now you can have a post-published delegate that will create first-class objects in WINDCHILL for these additional content types. So in this example, you could see we have a PVZ, a PNG, and a JPEG. In this case, the PNG will be created as a dynamic document and the JPEG as a document. And that's configurable in your publish rules. The other feature to mention is coming in WINDCHILL 12.1 is that you will be able to reuse variant specifications for filtering your information structures and publication structures. Variant specifications is a way to capture a set of options and choices for engineering data. And now you can also use those when you want to filter your service structures. Now, this only works with what colloquially we refer to as the skinny variant specifications. So it only works with standalone variant specifications the ones that are specifically associated to an option set, not the ones that are tied specifically to a configurable module, the original type of variant specification. But if you have the newer type of variant specification that's associated to an object set, you can select them. You can see in the saved filters dropdown, there's the find variant specification that would allow you to search for variant specs. And then once you've used them, they will also appear in your recent list. So, you would be able to see your recently used variant specifications. And again, this is coming shortly, hopefully before the end of December. So those were the features I wanted to just mention as far as new in service SPII in WINDCHILL.